I'd never felt anything like it before. From the moment I met Padma, my life split into before and after. She was older than me, only 5 years, but it felt like a lifetime. She carried a kind of elegance, a self-assuredness that I found intoxicating. I was used to dating girls my age, girls who laughed too loud at bars and whose conversations drifted between social media and gossip. Padma was different. She had a quiet, magnetic energy, an intensity that drew me in from the start. We met at an art exhibit in the city. I'd only gone because a friend of mine was showcasing some of his work and I was trying to be supportive. But as soon as I saw her, I forgot why I was there. Padma stood alone in front of a painting, her dark eyes thoughtful, her lips pressed into a slight, contemplative smile. Her black hair flowed over her shoulders, and she was dressed in a deep blue dress that seemed to match the mood of the gallery. I watched her from across the room, feeling like a nervous kid for the first time in years. Somehow, I managed to introduce myself, fumbling through small talk until she laughed. Low, melodic sound that made my pulse race. We started talking about the exhibit, then about art in general, and I found myself captivated by how easily she could move between ideas. Padma had lived in India before coming to the States, she told me, and her stories had a texture and richness that made my own life feel embarrassingly bland. She was the kind of woman who'd traveled, who'd taken risks, who didn't seem bound by anyone else's expectations. I couldn't get enough. Within a week, we were spending nearly every day together. I'd meet her after work, and we'd wander the city for hours, talking about everything and nothing. She made me feel like the world was brimming with possibility, like I'd been sleepwalking through life before I met her. And when we were alone, when it was just the two of us tangled together in my tiny apartment, every touch, every whisper felt electric. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she didn't hesitate. I found myself wanting to please her, to be the man she seemed to believe I was. 2 weeks into our whirlwind romance, Padma moved in with me. I was surprised when she suggested it. We'd only known each other for such a short time, and yet it felt natural, inevitable even. It was as if I'd been waiting for her my entire life, without realizing it. I told myself it was meant to be. "Are you sure?" I'd asked her, not wanting to seem too eager but barely able to hide my excitement. Padma had just laughed. That low, confident sound that made my heart pound. "Why not? Will, life's too short to wait. I want to wake up next to you. I want to be here with you. Isn't that what you want too?" And of course it was everything I wanted. So we packed up her things, and within a day, my apartment was transformed. Her books on the shelves, her scent lingering in every room, her laughter filling every quiet space. There was just one thing I hadn't considered. My father. My father, Kamal, and I had shared this apartment since I was in high school after my mother had passed away. He wasn't exactly the warm and fuzzy type. Kamal was rough, around the edges, bearded, rugged, with a quiet intensity that sometimes felt more intimidating than comforting. He'd grown up in a small village in India, moved to the States in his 20s, and made a life here through sheer willpower and stubbornness. While I'd grown up in the city, drifting toward art and books, Kamal was all grit. He worked long hours at a warehouse and spent his weekends fixing things around the apartment, as if he couldn't bear to sit still. His way of expressing love was indirect. He'd never say it, but he'd make sure I was fed, that I had a roof over my head, that I could pursue my dreams, even if he didn't understand them. When I told him about Padma, he barely reacted. I wasn't sure what I'd expected, disapproval, maybe, or one of his rare grunts of approval, but he simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Bring her here if you want," he said in his deep, gravelly voice. "If you're serious about her, she should meet me." It was hard to tell if that was an invitation or a test, but I agreed. A few days later, Padma moved in and she met Kamal for the first time. That initial meeting was strange, to say the least. Kamal and Padma were both reserved, both intense in their own ways, and the air between them felt charged, like two forces sizing each other up. Kamal's sharp, dark eyes studied her, his face expressionless, as if he were looking for something hidden beneath her polished exterior. For a brief moment I felt a flicker of unease, though I wasn't sure why. But then Padma broke the tension with a warm smile, reaching out to shake his hand. "It's nice to meet you, Kamal," she said, her tone gentle but confident. "Will has told me a lot about you." Kamal nodded, his hand lingering in hers a moment too long before he pulled away. "You're welcome here, Padma. Make yourself at home." His voice was cordial, but there was an undertone to it that I couldn't quite place. That night, after we'd unpacked the last of her things, I asked Padma what she thought of him. "He's interesting," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "He's got a strong presence. I can see where you get it from." I laughed, brushing it off. "Trust me, I'm nothing like him." "Oh, I don't know about that," she replied, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite read. Over the next few days, I was so wrapped up in Padma's presence, in the thrill of our new life together, that I barely noticed the subtle shifts happening around me. But slowly I began to sense something, a tension in the air, something unspoken yet unmistakable. Padma and Kamal began spending more time together, casually at first. I'd find them in the kitchen in the mornings, drinking tea and talking in hushed voices. Once I came home early from work to find them sitting on the couch, engrossed in a quiet conversation. They both looked up abruptly when I entered, as if I'd interrupted something. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my own insecurities. I told myself they were just getting to know each other. After all, Padma was part of my life now, so it made sense for her to form a bond with my father. But then there were the small, inexplicable moments. To catch Padma watching him with a faint smile, her eyes lingering a bit too long. Or I'd notice Kamal's hand resting on her shoulder as he passed by, a gesture that seemed strangely intimate, almost possessive. Didn't make sense. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that I was just being paranoid, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, I watched as Padma leaned in to tell a story, her gaze flickering between me and Kamal. She laughed at something he said, her hand resting briefly on his arm. I felt a surge of irritation, but forced myself to smile, brushing it off. I had no reason to be jealous of my own father, and yet I couldn't ignore the strange tension building between them, or the knot forming in my stomach whenever I saw them together. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a shadow lurking beneath the surface, hinting at something I didn't want to see. For the first time, I began to wonder if bringing Padma into my home, into my life with my father, had been a mistake. But the thought felt absurd, ridiculous even. She loved me, and my father was my father. Surely, I told myself, there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make it go away. It started with the little things, fleeting glances, touches that lingered a moment too long. Wanted to believe I was imagining it, that I was being paranoid. But the more I watched, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, I came home from work to find Padma and my father in the kitchen, laughing softly together. The sound was strange, almost intimate, like an echo from a world that didn't include me. They didn't hear me come in, so I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. Padma was leaning against the counter, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. She was dressed in a simple white tank top and loose pants, her hair falling in soft waves. Over her shoulders, Kamal stood close, his broad frame casting a shadow over her, his hand braced on the counter beside her. They were so close that I felt a twist of something dark and ugly in my stomach. "So, Kamal," she said, her voice low, almost playful, "is it true what they say, that you were quite the heartbreaker back in the day?" He chuckled, looking down with a faint smile. "Who told you that, Will?" He shot her a sidelong glance, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "No," she said, smirking. "I can tell just by looking at you. You have that dangerous look." She tilted her head, studying him with a glint in her eyes that made my skin prickle. "You must have driven all the women crazy." Kamal laughed softly, scratching his beard, but he didn't look away. "I don't know about that. My life was simpler back then. I had responsibilities, things I had to take care of." "Responsibility," she echoed, letting the word hang in the air. "You know, there's something incredibly attractive about a man who knows his duty, who takes care of the people he loves." She smiled, and it wasn't the kind of smile she gave me. It was slower, more deliberate, a smile that seemed to say more than words ever could. I felt a flare of anger rise up in my chest. This was absurd. I was standing right there, invisible to both of them, watching my father and my girlfriend. What? Flirting? Was that really what I was seeing? I cleared my throat, louder than necessary, and they both looked up, startled. Padma's eyes flicked toward me, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flash of guilt there. But then she smiled, her expression as warm and innocent as ever. "Hey, Will," she said, straightening up. "We were just talking about you." "Yeah?" "Sounded more like you were talking about him," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. Kamal raised an eyebrow, but he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Padma walked over and slid her arms around my waist, pressing a kiss to my cheek. "Don't be silly," she whispered. "You know I only have eyes for you." But as she pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that her words didn't match the look in her eyes. The tension between us grew over the next few days. I didn't want to accuse her of anything. The whole thing felt ridiculous. She was my girlfriend, and Kamal was my father. The very idea that something could be going on between them was absurd. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, that I was being slowly pushed out of my own relationship by the quiet, unspoken connection that seemed to be building between them. One Saturday morning, I found Padma and Kamal in the living room, deep in conversation. She was sitting on the arm of his chair, leaning down to say something in a low, almost conspiratorial voice. They were laughing softly, their heads close together. When I walked in, they both looked up, but neither of them moved. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "What's so funny?" Padma looked at me, her eyes sparkling with something I couldn't name. "Your dad was just telling me about the time he got lost in the mountains on a camping trip. Did you know he had to build a shelter out of nothing but branches and leaves?" I glanced at my father, who shrugged, looking mildly amused. "It wasn't as dramatic as she's making it sound," he said. "Just something you do to survive." Padma smiled, her gaze lingering on him. "Still, it's impressive. I don't know many men who could do that. Most people these days would just pull out their phones and call for help." She looked back at me, her eyes slightly teasing. "I wonder if you'd manage out there, Will." I bristled, feeling defensive. "I could handle it if I had to, just because I don't have a beard. And a grizzly man look doesn't mean I'm useless." Padma laughed, a low, throaty sound that made my skin crawl. She reached out, patting my shoulder. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm just teasing." But her hand lingered a bit too long, her fingers brushing my collarbone in a way that felt almost dismissive. I forced myself to smile, but inside, I felt something cold and bitter settling in my chest. A few days later, the three of us were having dinner together. I watched as Padma filled Kamal's plate with an extra helping of food, her fingers grazing his hand as she handed it over. He didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her, a subtle smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Thank you, Padma," he murmured, his tone warmer than usual. "It's nice to have someone take care of me for a change." She laughed softly, her eyes flicking to me briefly before returning to him. "Well, Kamal, I'd say you deserve it. After all, you've done so much for your family." The words were innocent enough, but the way she said them, it was like there was an undercurrent there, something I wasn't supposed to hear. I felt my grip tighten on my fork. "Dad's always been self-sufficient," I said, forcing a smile. "He doesn't need anyone to take care of him." Kamal raised an eyebrow, giving me a measured look. "Everyone needs someone, Will. Even me." Padma glanced at him, and for a split second, there was a look in her eyes, a warmth, softness that I had once thought was reserved for me. My heart sank, and I looked away, trying to keep my expression neutral. But inside I was burning. Later that night, after Kamal had gone to bed, I confronted Padma. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Padma, what's going on between you and my father?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. She looked at me, surprised, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something that looked almost like amusement. "Will, are you serious? You've been close. Too close. The way you look at him, the way you touch him." I broke off, feeling my throat tighten. Padma sighed, shaking her head. She reached out, taking my hands in hers, and gave me a sympathetic look. "Will, he's your father. Of course I'm going to try to connect with him." "Thought that's what you wanted. For me to be part of your family." "Yeah, but it doesn't feel like that. It feels like—" I trailed off, unable to put my suspicions into words. She smiled softly, squeezing my hands. "You're overthinking this, love. He's an older man, and I'm with you. Why would I want anything with him?" Her words made sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my lips, and for a moment, I let myself believe her. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was all in my head. But as she pulled away, her hand brushed my cheek in a lingering way, her gaze flickering with something I couldn't name. I watched her walk down the hall toward the bedroom and felt a gnawing, painful doubt settle in my gut. I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked into the kitchen that evening. The atmosphere between Padma and my father felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't name but could sense all the same. They stood close together by the counter, their voices low, barely more than whispers. As I entered, they fell silent, and for a brief, tense moment, neither of them moved. Padma noticed me first and turned, a slightly flushed look on her face, as though she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. She offered me a smile, one that seemed too bright, too forced, like a mask. "Will," she said, her voice warm but a bit too casual. "We were just talking about dinner." But it wasn't the words that unsettled me. It was the way she was standing, her posture, relaxed, leaning just a little too comfortably close to my father. And then, in that brief pause, before I could respond, I saw it. Kamal's hand lingered on her hip, his fingers resting there, with a familiarity that made my stomach twist. It felt like a small, intimate gesture, a touch that should have been mine to give, not his. My voice was colder than I intended. "I didn't realize you two had so much in common," I said, crossing my arms and looking from one to the other. Padma laughed, a soft, strained sound. "Oh, come on, Will. We were just talking." But the tension in her face told a different story. Kamal removed his hand slowly, as if aware of my gaze, but he didn't look away. Instead, he met my eyes with a challenging, steady expression, a glint in his eyes that felt defiant. "Will," he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever, "there's no need to be jealous of a conversation. You know that." I could feel the anger rising, a hot, uncontainable wave. "Jealous? I'm not jealous. But maybe you should think about how things look." Padma's face grew tense, her gaze darting between us. "Will, please, you're overreacting." But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling, that knot of doubt twisting tighter inside me. Muttered something under my breath and left the kitchen, feeling their eyes on me as I walked away. A few nights later, everything came crashing down. I had come home late, hoping to avoid both of them, hoping a bit of distance would help me clear my head. But as I walked down the hall, past my father's room, something made me stop. His door was slightly ajar, and I could hear a soft murmur, followed by a quiet, breathy laugh that sent a chill down my spine. I stepped closer, peering through the narrow gap in the door. There, in the dim light, I saw them. Padma was lying on his bed, her eyes closed, an expression of unguarded satisfaction on her face. Kamal was close, leaning over her, his movements slow and purposeful, his presence dominating the space around her. Their connection, the intimacy in their movements was undeniable. They shared a closeness I couldn't deny, something I'd only felt the edges of until that moment. I felt frozen, rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the truth unraveled before my eyes. I had feared this, suspected it, but seeing it with my own eyes broke something inside me. This was more than a betrayal. It was a violation of everything I thought I knew, everything I thought I could trust. Without thinking, I stumbled back, my mind numb, my body moving on instinct. I barely made it to my room, slamming the door behind me, my chest tight with a pain I could barely contain. In that moment, I knew there was no going back. The morning after my discovery felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream or a nightmare. I barely slept, images of what I'd seen the night before playing over and over in my mind, each one more painful than the last. The woman I loved and my own father. The betrayal was so deep, so unthinkable, that I couldn't even find words for the pain it caused. Felt hollow, as though everything that had once given my life meaning had been taken from me. I didn't know how I would face them, but I knew I had to. I couldn't stay in that house a second longer than necessary. I packed a small bag quietly, trying to avoid any conversation. But as I was zipping it up, I heard footsteps in the hallway. The door opened, and there they stood, both of them side by side, as though they were in this together. The sight of them like that, united in their betrayal, made my stomach turn. Padma took a tentative step toward me, her face pale. "Will, please, just let us explain." I felt my fists clench, every muscle in my body tense as I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Explain?" I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What could you possibly say that would make any of this right?" Kamal stepped forward, his expression as unreadable as ever, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, regret maybe, or guilt. "Will, I didn't want this to happen, but sometimes life doesn't go as planned." "Life doesn't go as planned?" I echoed, anger flaring in my chest. "You think that's an excuse? You knew how much she meant to me. You knew what you were doing." Padma reached out, trying to touch my arm, but I stepped back, avoiding her gaze. "I never meant to hurt you, Will," she murmured, her voice soft, pleading. "But your father and we—" "Stop!" I cut her off, unable to bear hearing her finish that sentence. I didn't want to know. Didn't want any more details, any more reminders of how they'd both chosen to betray me. "You two deserve each other." I said, the bitterness sharp in my voice. I just can't believe I was stupid enough to think I mattered to either of you. They exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes, that told me everything I needed to know. Whatever they had between them, it was real, at least to them. Real enough for them to throw me aside. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep the last remnants of my dignity intact. I'm leaving, I said. I don't want to hear from either of you ever again. Without waiting for a response, I pushed past them, heading for the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard my father's voice, quiet and almost pleading. Will, I'm sorry. I paused, my hand on the door, but I didn't look back. It's too late for that. And with that, I walked out, leaving behind the people who had once been my entire world. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. It wasn't easy. The memories of Padma and my father haunted me, appearing in quiet moments when I least expected them. But slowly, I learned to live with the pain, to let it become part of who I was without letting it control me. I heard through mutual friends that Kamal and Padma went on to marry. The news hit me like a punch, reopening wounds I thought had begun to heal. But by then I was different, stronger, more resilient. I knew that my life didn't need to be defined by their choices. Their betrayal no longer had power over me. In time, I found peace. I moved to a new city, started fresh, and surrounded myself with people I could trust. I'd learned a painful lesson about love, loyalty, and betrayal, and while it left scars, it also taught me strength. I knew now that some bonds could be broken, that family wasn't always sacred, and that sometimes walking away was the only way to truly move forward. As for Kamal and Padma, I hoped they found whatever it was they were looking for, but I'd moved on. Their chapter in my life was closed, locked away in a part of my heart that I no longer needed to visit. I was free, finally free, and that was enough.